Hi, and welcome to the Compassion in Therapy Summit. I'm Dr. Ravi Chandra, a psychiatrist, writer, filmmaker, and compassion educator in San Francisco. Links to find out more about my work are in my bio, and I'm delighted to be your host. I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Ron Siegel to explore the use of mindfulness and compassion in the treatment of anxiety and depression. Dr. Siegel is an assistant professor of psychology part-time at Harvard Medical School, where he has taught for over 35 years. He is a longtime student of mindfulness meditation and is the author of many books, including The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are, and The Mindfulness Solution, Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems. He is also the professor for The Science of Mindfulness, a research-based path to well-being produced by the Great Courses. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Siegel.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the last 2 years have been quite difficult and isolating for older folks, for children, for teens, for everyone. And anxiety and depression have become much more common experiences. How do you view anxiety, depression, and suicidality as a therapist who specializes in mindfulness?
I tend to view them in the context of human suffering more broadly. And I'm afraid my way of looking at that could sound a little depressing at first, which is, I don't think we evolved to be happy. In fact, there's good evidence that our brains evolved for survival, and whatever tendency of the brain would help us to reproduce, pass those genes on, and then help us to ensure our children's survival, those are the ones that stuck. Those are the tendencies that we see in ourselves currently. And the ones that didn't, well, they fell away in the course of evolutionary history. And I think there are 4 main tendencies of the brain that actually contribute to our propensity to get anxious and depressed, and contribute to other disorders as well. And luckily, those same 4 propensities are counteracted by mindfulness and compassion practices. So I think what I'd like to do is take a look at each of them, take a look at how they manifest and contribute to anxiety and depression, and then take a look at how we can use mindfulness and compassion practices as their antidotes. So the first universal propensity of the brain is to avoid pain and to avoid discomfort. We have this very powerful tendency toward what broadly is thought of as experiential avoidance, trying to get rid of things that hurt. This makes perfect sense. We share it with all the other animals. Even a bacterium will pull away from a toxin and gravitate toward food. And the way that this manifests in us as human beings is very often being involved in some kind of escape avoidance activity, something that draws us away from being with our current experience. And I think it'll be easy to show how that manifests in all sorts of ways in creating anxiety and depression. The second one has a long history evolutionarily, but is somewhat more recent. If we imagine our great grandmother, Lucy, out there on the African savannah 4 or 4.5 million years ago, we know she survived because we have her DNA. But how did she survive? What did she have beyond this basic impulse to avoid that which is unpleasant and, the fight or flight system, which is part of that? How did she survive? She was only about 1 meter high. She wasn't very fast. The first thing they tell you if you ever go on a so-called walking safari in Africa is no matter what happens, don't run. Why? Because everything out there that's scary is faster than you are. And if you run, they're just going to think that you're prey if they're a predator. So she couldn't run away from things. Her skin wasn't very tough. How did she make it? Well, by far and away, her aces in the hole were, okay, fight or flight response to respond to emergencies. That's the experiential avoidance part. She had a prehensile thumb that was going to be useful for making tools later on when she evolved into Homo habilis. She was a social animal, so she could cooperate with others. But her real ace in the hole was her ability to think, right? She could imagine past experiences, recall them, strategize for the future, and plan how to maximize survival in the future. And this capacity for thinking, while wonderful, comes along with a really strong negativity bias, because it was not simply a neutral computer that Lucy had, but she had a mind that, as my friend Rick Hansen likes to say, was like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. The bad experiences stuck, the good ones slide right off the pan. And we can understand this if we look at the kinds of errors Lucy might have made out there on the savannah. We can call them type 1 and type 2 errors, roughly corresponding to type 1 and type 2 errors in modern research. A type 1 error would have been a false positive. It would have been to look at a beige shape behind some rocks and to think, oh my God, it's a lion, when it was really just a beige rock. A type 2 error would be to look at the same thing and say, it's probably a beige rock, when it was really a lion. Now, Lucy could have made countless type 1 errors and still lived to tell, still passed on her genes. One type 2 error, end of her DNA line. So we might imagine that they were happy hominids, holding hands, recalling and telling stories of dynamite sexual encounters and luscious pieces of fruit back there in the day. But they weren't our ancestors. Why? Because statistically, they died before they got to reproduce. Our ancestors were the ones going around the savannah remembering, oh my God, it could be a lion. Uh-oh, that might be a poisonous snake. Looks like one of those plants. Remember what happened to Uncle Charlie when he encountered one last year? On and on and on. And that propensity to think and to remember the bad stuff, we'll see, plays a huge role in anxiety and depression, and mindfulness practices can help us with that. A third thing is what we might call the tendency toward reification, right? The way in which we tend to take processes that are fluid and see them as solid. And this made sense evolutionarily too, because you wanted to be able to predict and control the future as much as possible. And if you identify a pattern and start to think, okay, this is how things work, we tend to hang on to that. And we'll see how this failure to notice that everything is much more fluid than our mind takes it to be also plays a huge role in anxiety and depression. And the fourth one that we'll dig into a bit here today, because it's of particular interest to me lately, is our propensity to be self-preoccupied. Our propensity particularly to worry about how we're doing and how we compare to the other primates in the troop. Evolutionarily, what happened was those who were at the top of the pecking order, and there are various sorts of pecking orders. They tend to be somewhat gendered. You know, for males, it tends to be being the dominant male, right, who has access to more reproductively promising females. For females, historically, it tended to be consorting with those dominant males, because those are the ones who had a better chance of reproducing and a better chance of passing on their DNA and getting the resources necessary for their partners and for their kids. So we have a lot of preoccupation with how we compare to others. And this shows up in humans as concern with self-esteem. The constant pattern going through our minds throughout the day of, how am I doing? Right now, I'm doing this webinar. Am I being clear? Are these good topics to talk about? Now, part of this is wanting to offer something useful, but part of this is wanting you to like Ron, wanting me to be able to feel that, oh yeah, Ron's a successful teacher at the end of this. This kind of stuff informs our psychology quite a bit, particularly once we start to look at it. And it's a huge source of anxiety and depression for many of us. So those are the four propensities. So let's look for a moment, if we may, at how they manifest in anxiety disorders, how they manifest in depressive disorders, and then we can go from there to look at how mindfulness and compassion practices might help us. Well, experiential avoidance is at the heart of anxiety disorders. If I get anxious before public speaking, or I get anxious before, I don't know, flying on airplanes, but I do those things anyway, I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just a nervous guy. I happen to be a nervous guy, so I know what this is like. If, on the other hand, I start to avoid public speaking in order not to feel anxious, or avoid flying on airplanes in order not to feel anxious, well, then I have an anxiety disorder. There's this wonderful story that I once heard from an actor who is going to portray an astronaut in a movie about the early space program. And the actor wanted to portray the astronaut faithfully. So he said to the astronaut, you know, I don't know, where did you get the courage to go up in those early rockets? I would have been terrified. And the astronaut said to him, you know, I don't think you fully understand courage. And a little aside, I had a chance to do some work for NASA once. Sounds fancy. I ran a program for the EAP employees at NASA, but I got to be at the Kennedy Space Center, behind the scenes for a couple of days. And what I learned was in the early days of the US space program, we were in competition with what was then the Soviet Union. And we had good technology, but we didn't have infrastructure. We didn't have a lot of rockets. And the engineers at NASA came up with this great idea. They said, well, we don't have rockets, but we do have a very large arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiply targeted warheads sitting on each one. What if we metaphorically unscrew the nuclear warheads from the top of the missiles and craft a capsule that would fit on top and use that to get people into space? And that was the Gemini capsules. Those very first capsules were made to sit on the top of ICBMs. Now, the astronauts were Air Force guys, and they knew what was going on. And as you might imagine, they had some feelings about being shot into space on top of an ICBM. And so the astronaut said, I don't think you understand courage. Courage isn't about avoiding or not feeling anxious. Courage is about feeling anxious and doing what you need to do anyway. So what we're going to see in the use of mindfulness practices to work with anxiety is we want to use them not to get rid of anxiety, not even to relax, but rather to develop the courage to be with anxiety, to not be acting on experiential avoidance in this way. Now, thinking, we see, is another huge source of anxiety. Take a moment to think of something that makes you anxious. Invite you to do this.
Sure. Yeah, I can think of many things.
Probably didn't take too long.
Yeah, I think a lot related to looking good in front of others, as you said earlier. That self-esteem is something that makes one anxious. What do people really think about me? That's something which we almost never know for sure, right?
And thank you so much for sharing that, because it makes me feel less alone about my anxieties about that, which, as we'll see, is one of the wonderful antidotes to this. So with the anxious thought, if you were to reflect right now, in this moment, here and now, as we're doing this interview together, if it weren't for the thought of the thing that worries you, would you be having a problem?
Oh no, that story making thing certainly puts a tremor in one's heart, right? The story making apparatus.
Exactly. So we really see that when it comes to anxiety, it's our stories, right? It's our thoughts of the future, right? That inevitably are what fuel the anxiety and what get it going. So if we might be able to lighten up on believing in those thoughts, well, then we'd have a path forward. And one of the wonderful things that mindfulness practice does is by bringing us back over and over to a sensory object, such as the breath, or the sensations of the body sitting in the chair, or the sky and the trees, by bringing us out of the thought stream and connecting to present sensory reality. In that moment, we develop a little perspective on thought. We develop a little bit of this, what's called metacognitive awareness, the ability to see that a thought is a thought. And we're not going to make anxious thoughts go away, but we can gradually come to see, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, rather than identifying with them so much. And to backtrack for a moment with the experiential avoidance part, the way that mindfulness practices are going to be able to help us with that is, what do we do in mindfulness practice? We sit there and discomfort arises, right? We feel, our knee hurts, an itch comes up, an ache, and we learn in mindfulness practices, I can just kind of turn my attention to that and be with it. And oftentimes it transforms by itself, but even if it doesn't, I can develop the capacity to do that. And that's going to help us to develop what we might call experiential approach, as opposed to experiential avoidance, which is our birthright and what comes most naturally. So moving down the list of these four, so it's experiential avoidance and experiential approach. There's believing in thoughts and the problem with the negativity bias. how that contributes to anxiety versus this capacity to have metacognitive awareness. The third one is reification. Ravi, if I may ask you another to try something else, and our viewers to try it as well. What was your worry 3 worries ago?
3 worries ago. Maybe there are some people, it probably some version of these things. How am I perceived? But the specifics often wash over.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. We can't really remember them. And I find that as an anxious guy, I find this fascinating, right? Because when I'm in the worry du jour, when I'm concerned with what I'm concerned with, it feels like that's going to be forever, right? This anxiety is going to stay with me forever. I'm never going to feel okay. If I'm worried about a problem, that problem is going to persist forever. This pain is going to persist forever. And what we see in mindfulness practice is, oh my gosh, it's also fluid. It is also impermanent. And many times impermanence is a curse, right? Oh my God, I'm getting older. Oh my God, sickness is real. Oh gosh, we can't hold on to anything. It's always changing, but it's also a real gift. We also start to see that whatever we're upset about, whatever we're scared about, that's going to change also. And then the fourth one is this self-preoccupation realm, and particularly this concern for self-esteem. How am I doing? How are other people looking at me? And here, this is a huge source of anxiety for so many of us. And we're usually on one or two sides of this, and we can dig into this maybe a little bit later. We're either hanging on to the feeling that I'm doing good, I'm doing a good job, people like me, I'm successful, etc. And we're kind of anxiously stressed all the time trying to hang on to this. Or we're starting to slip, right? And we're starting to feel that horrible sinking feeling, right? Of not being so successful, not thinking highly of ourselves and the like. And then we anxiously try to claw our way back. We try to reestablish some sense that we're going to be okay. So the other thing about anxiety is, I asked this of you and of our listeners, when I asked you a moment ago to think of something that made you anxious, I wonder how many people thought of global climate change. Now, it's not the first one that comes to mind for me. If I were really rational about what to be anxious about, it would be pretty high on the list. But usually what I'm anxious about is something happening to me or my loved ones, right? Sometimes is relatively trivial, as I'm going to embarrass myself or not do a good job here. Sometimes more profound, like, my health or the health of my loved ones or the happiness of my kids or something like that. But a lot of our anxiety is pretty self-oriented. It's about me and my little circle. And one of the other things we're going to see that we can use mindfulness practices for is to actually expand out so that our attention is less about me and more about connecting to others, connecting to the wider world, and even connecting to the wider ecosystem, to all of nature, to all of life. And these kinds of connections actually go a long way toward diminishing our anxiety, because mostly we're worried about us. And if we're not so preoccupied with us, we start to have a lot less anxiety. So I don't know, before I go in and talk about how these things also work with depression, you have any thoughts or anything you'd like me to clarify about this?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, first, I think the 4 items that you laid out are a perfect template for looking back on our history as a species and what we carry, each of us carrying a part of this. And I think certainly evolutionarily, our threats, as you know and you say, are not so much what they were 4 million years ago, but they're very much about social context. So the sense of connection and belonging becomes so important. So I think that's so vital, and that's differently carried for people of different cultures and experiences and groups. So I think there's so many layers to that. And yes, to this question of climate change and the threats of nuclear disaster that have resurfaced recently, we certainly we certainly wish to evolve more of what I call the eco-ego or the geocortex. So I hope we can talk about transcending or using the anxiety as a booster rocket to get us to that deeper place. But yeah, thank you.
Great way to think about it, and I look forward to doing that. And that is that's a topic I've been exploring a lot because it's the topic of a book that I recently finished. Okay, so let's look at depression. Then we can we'll be able to circle back. We'll look at depression. We'll look at compassion, and then circle back to that theme. So how does this work with depression? Well, let me invite you to do this, and I hope you're okay, Ravi, with me putting you on the spot as my audience, if you will, for these various experiments.
Sure.
But I'm also inviting
Sure,
our friends watching to do the same. We've all been sad and we've all been depressed at moments in our lives. And I know there's DSM kind of clinical depression, but now I'm asking about the everyday kind of sadness and depression that befalls us. And I wonder, in your personal experience, how do they feel different? What are the qualities of a moment or a state of sadness? And how do they differ from the qualities of a moment of depression? What might you say from your own experience?
Well, depression, are you speaking of the clinical term?
No, I'm talking about when we feel depressed, because we all have this experience, at least I do, that I'll have moments in which I feel kind of depressed, and I'll have moments when I feel sad, and they feel different.
Well, for me, I think I sense depression as a more isolated state, and sadness is something more connected to the human experiences of loss and longing, etc., that I spoke about. So depression feels much more sunken into myself. That's how I perceive it.
Yeah, I absolutely feel the same thing, that when I'm depressed, I'm really cut off from others. I'm cut off from a sense of connection. I have a fair amount of hopelessness, right? There's this very negative narrative is going through my head. And the other thing, I don't know if this is part of your experience, I feel kind of deadened when I feel depressed, whereas I don't feel deadened when I'm sad. When I'm sad,
absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, I've had moments at a funeral, for example, where where I'm quite sad and others are quite sad, and somebody will remember something humorous that the deceased did, and there's joy, right? There's a kind of fluidity. It's not stuck, it flows. So, and when Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago, parting is such sweet sorrow, we read him today and we understand what he meant. Had he said, parting is such sweet depression, we'd think this guy can't write, and we probably would still be reading him today. So there's this deadness or the shutting down. And what I would propose, and has been my clinical experience, is that sadness involves a kind of experiential avoidance. There's a kind of shutting down on the full range of emotion that happens, a kind of deadening of the nervous system, even a collapse of the nervous system, right? That cuts us off from vital energy, it cuts us off from connection, it cuts us off from life. So here's the way in which experiential avoidance is playing a role in depression. And again, if mindfulness practice is going to be about experiential approach, about bringing us into connection with the full range of our experience, we could see how that might work as an antidote there. Second big part of depression is believing in our thoughts. When we're depressed, we're ruminative, right? We're constantly going over the same chain. Nobody's ever going to love me. I'm a failure at what I've done. I'm morally bereft. I'm ugly. Or my life is hopeless, or I've hit a wall, but it's very, very ruminative, right? And we believe in these kind of core beliefs that are quite depressogenic and get us stuck in them. So as we know from the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which was originally developed to treat depression, moving people from ruminating on their core beliefs to connecting to sensory reality is one way to get the metacognitive awareness that allows us to see, oh, that's another depressive thought coming up, as opposed to believing in and as solid this these narratives that we have that maintain our depression. So the third element, if you will, the third propensity of mind, this propensity for reification, for seeing as solid things that are fluid. Oh gosh, does this happen in depression? When we're depressed, the state feels completely solid. Very interesting, because I've asked a number of audiences this issue about, what's your subjective experience of how depression and sadness differ from one another? And oftentimes people say, well, depression feels like it will last forever. And sadness, we know that it's transitory. And that's pretty much the case. It doesn't mean depression will last forever. I can be depressed for 2 hours. I could be sad for several days, but during those 2 hours in which I'm depressed, I think it's going to last forever, and it feels permanent and it feels solid. And I don't get it that no, everything is fluid, everything is changing. So here too, if we can use mindfulness practices to help us to start to notice the fluidity of things, it's going to get us less stuck. And then finally, the shift out of self-preoccupation. I've never met somebody whose depression was not self-oriented. When I'm depressed, you're suggesting this, Ravi, and what you're just saying, when I'm depressed, it's all about me, right? It's all about how Ron is doing, what people think of Ron, what's Ron's prospects. Is Ron ever going to have joy again in his life? It's all about the Ron show. It is not about my community. It is not about a wider sense of connection. It's not about the wider world. We narrow so much when we're depressed. And here again, as we look at how we can use mindfulness practices, and particularly compassion practices, to move out of this sense of separate, isolated self into a sense of interconnection, we'll see that there's a lot of possibility to harness these practices.
Yes, thank you. So I want to get back to that concept of self-concept and self-preoccupation. But first, I do also want to touch on compassion. How can the introduction of compassion and self-compassion help a client suffering from anxiety, sadness, and depression?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and really so central to our work. When we think of the predictors of psychological well-being or risk factors for psychological well-being, and there are many, but the one that comes up over and over and over in the research is, what was our attachment history like? Genetics play a role, certainly the relative difficulties in our environment play a role, marginalization plays a role, societal issues play a role, and yet, what shines through so often is, what was your attachment history like? Did you, as a child, have the experience of being in emotional distress and having some caring adult hold you in their arms and, in essence, be some combination of the Rogers, Carl and Mr.? Carl Rogers' capacity for empathy and to be able to understand us and help us to feel felt by the caregiver, and Mr. Rogers' beautiful way of communicating, won't you be my neighbor? I want to be with you. You are okay just as you are. You're okay, sweetheart. And when we've had those experiences as a kid, we have a greater chance of being able to re-reference them when we're in distress later on in our life. We're better able to feel our distress and also have a sense of being held here, I mean, literally, as well as the way Winnicott used to use that phrase in terms of therapeutic holding. We're able to feel held, and we're able to feel that we're going to be okay with this. And that is so enormously important, both for anxiety and depression, because when we're anxious, if we're with the anxiety, but we have a sense that there's love available, that it's possible to be loved in our anxiety, it's possible to connect with the common humanity of other people who are anxious, when we're not filled with a lot of self-condemnation for it, but feel loved, held, it's soothing. it really helps us to be able to connect, to be able to tolerate the feelings and not kind of panic about being anxious, because we're able to hold the anxiety. The other way in which compassion, and particularly having this capacity for self-compassion, which, it's very interesting. Many of you know the work of Kristen Neff, studying this, who developed a scale for this, and my friend Chris Germer and Kristen Neff developing a program for cultivating this and finding that all sorts of positive things flow from this. Higher self-compassion correlates to everything good in exactly the same way that a secure attachment history correlates to everything good. And I think that's because they're the same thing. I think that's because when we have a secure attachment history, we have this capacity for self-compassion. So when we measure self-compassion or later develop it, it's the equivalent of having something like a secure attachment history. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to have the courage to be with a wide range of feelings. And the reason why this is particularly important when we're dealing with anxiety is much of anxiety is what Freud called signal anxiety. We're actually afraid of other emotions. So to take a stereotypical example, if I'm a guy who grew up in a patriarchal culture and I've taken in some toxic masculinity messages, I might feel I mustn't be vulnerable. I mustn't cry. I mustn't show this. In fact, when working with men, many of whom grew up in these environments, I'll often ask, so when was the last time you cried? And it's hard for them to remember. And I say, when did you learn not to? Very interesting to start looking at. When did I cut off that feeling? Very often our anxiety is signal anxiety. We're afraid that we're going to encounter some feeling. For me, when I'm anxious, very often, if I take a moment with some mindfulness and self-compassion to go inside and to say, what am I really afraid of here? I'm afraid of some disappointment, some rejection, some humiliation that's going to make me feel vulnerable and hurt and perhaps sad or rejected. And the anxiety is actually because I'm afraid of that feeling. And if I can open to that feeling and I can find a self-compassionate way to hold that feeling, well, everything's transformed, because then once the feeling's there, I'm no longer afraid of it. I'm able to be with it, and the anxiety starts to subside. And something very similar happens when we're working with depression, because since depression involves being cut off from feeling, and depression often involves being cut off from our vulnerability, our longing for love, our sadness, our desires to be held. Instead of feeling these, as Shakespeare would put it, parting is such sweet sorrow, instead of feeling these poignantly, we shut down. If we can use our compassion practices to soothe ourselves and comfort ourselves and allow it to be okay, because we're with Carl and Mr. Rogers, so it's all right to be able to be sad, well, we're going to be a lot less depressed. It's going to become fluid and it's going to be able to flow.
Right. I love this reminder that we are who happens to us, and our earliest relationships inform us, and we internalize those. And if the people in our lives can be with our difficulties, and when we're in a difficult state, we learn how to be with those. And the same thing, I think you would say, with a compassionate therapist is helping us be with those difficult moments. But I think, as an aside, I think we always need help. I think we're always, no one completely self-regulates. So maybe that's something you might want to talk about it in terms of, how we help each other with anxiety and these other states. I think a lot of what we're talking about is how we can help ourselves or help our clients help themselves with these difficult states. But compassion kind of breaks that fourth wall, so to speak, and helps us co-regulate. So thank you so much for that reminder about the importance of compassion. And in your new book, The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, you acknowledge a common theme you've seen working with people for so many years, that we all just want to feel good about ourselves, and that we often don't. There's both a ubiquitous experience and one that is often central to more severe presentations of depression and anxiety. How do we typically self-evaluate and construct self-esteem? And how can mindfulness and compassion help dislodge harmful tendencies?
Yeah, this is, thank you for asking. It's a favorite topic of mine these days. The book actually was, to tell you the truth, it began as a self-treatment project, because here I was in my, at that point, kind of early to mid 60s, and having spent a good 4 decades being a psychotherapist or being in psychotherapy myself, as well as at least as long doing mindfulness practices and compassion practices. And you would think that these practices and the therapy would be designed to develop something like a secure, stable sense of self, or at least not to be preoccupied with how other people are viewing me anymore. Well, it hadn't worked. There I was still going up and down, sometimes, sometimes every hour, as my good friend Paul Fulton put it, his thing about his sense of himself as a psychologist. I'm about as good as my last session. If it went well, I think, hey, I'm an experienced, talented, compassionate, wise psychologist. If it went poorly, I knew I should have become an engineer. This isn't my calling. And this was still to some degree happening to me. And I'm seeing it in so many of the clients I work with, that I got really interested in, why is this so robust? Why so much difficulty with this, despite working on ourselves over so much time? And I came to the conclusion that this is pretty strongly hardwired. We have a lot of instincts toward social comparison and toward how we rank vis-a-vis one another. And it's not just us. Birds have pecking orders, right? There are species of crickets that if you put them together in a box, they'll organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy within like a minute or so. Children will organize themselves into what are called transitive dominance hierarchies. So if Juanita knows that she can kind of dominate Susie, and Susie knows that she can dominate Hakeem, well, Hakeem knows that he can be dominated by Juanita. In other words, we size each other up and we have a sense of where we fit in these different pecking orders. And with kids, it may be about strength or assertiveness. With professionals, it might be about, who's more well-known, who has done more stuff, who has a higher position in academic circles, who's at what university. This goes on and on and on, the ways in which we wind up making these kinds of social comparisons. And, in meditative circles, this is even more humorous, right? Like, who's less concerned with ego? Who's less preoccupied with self-esteem? Who's transcended this more? We can compete over that, right? So this propensity is so strong because, all the other social mammals do it also. We're just stuck in this. And the way it shows up in us, of course, is much more symbolic. We're not necessarily beating our chests and posturing in ways to lord ourselves over others. But boy, oh boy, do we do it in terms of class signaling? Do we do it in terms of in-group and out-group concerns? Do we do it in terms of worrying, how I look? Am I too heavy? Who's taller? Who's more buff or physically fit, who's smarter, who's written more books, whose Amazon ratings are higher. Sorry, folks, I'm in that world and it shows up that way. This stuff is really, really ubiquitous. And the sad part is we can't win. We can never win at this social comparison game. And that's because unless we live in Lake Wobegon, where, as they say, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average, well, there's no way to be on top consistently because half the group's always got to be below average. And worse, there are two things that really, really trap us in this. One of them is what we might call narcissistic recalibration. And that's whatever once floated our boat, made us feel good about ourselves, stops working. Now, many of our listeners are psychotherapists. That means many of them earned a form of advanced degree that let them practice as psychotherapists. You did, Ravi, I did as well. And I wonder how many of us woke up this morning feeling, yeah, I feel really good about myself. I have my advanced degree. Now, there was a time, right, when getting that meant a big deal. You're a physician. I have a daughter. I remember when she first, who's a physician, when she first showed me her MD, name tag, that meant a lot back then, right? But these things stop working. I once, asked this question to an audience of psychotherapists, and everybody starts laughing, right? And then this one therapist, starts raising their hand, newly minted, because her degree still matters to her in that way. And, why is everybody laughing? Because we habituate, right? There was a time where putting the multicolored rings on the pole in the right size order, hey, I did it. Look, mommy and daddy, it doesn't float our boat anymore. So we recalibrate, we start needing more and more. And the other thing is, even if we win, right? Let's say we're really great at what we do. We're an Olympic athlete and we win the gold medal. What are the chances we're going to win it in 4 years or 8 years? What goes up goes down. So there's simply no way to win at this game. And nowadays, it's made so much worse with social media, where we're looking at people's, curated images. How many people post on social media, woke up this morning, had the runs again, afraid my girlfriend's going to leave me, and I'm going to get a bad performance review at work. No, it's like, here I am at this fantastic party, doing fantastic things with fantastic people, and you're not here. That's what we post. If we were nation states or countries, it would be like we're looking at our own crime and poverty statistics and reading everybody else's travel brochures. So we live in this world in which, this drives us absolutely crazy and makes us so deeply unhappy. And it's really worth trying to find antidotes to this. And there are some, because we not only have instincts for competition and instincts for being on top and making sure our DNA gets passed down, but we have instincts for cooperation. We have instincts for nurturing one another. We have instincts for connecting with the other members of our tribe. Remember, our brains evolved in groups of 25 to 50, and that's who you were with your whole life. Imagine like your first grade class, and basically some older, some younger, and some will die and be born, but a group that big, right? That was your whole life. Well, you better connect to people. And you know what? You better be honest. And you know what? If somebody shares their wildebeest with you one day when they bring it home, you sure as hell better share your wildebeest with them, because everybody's going to know, and they're not going to share their wildebeest with you anymore if you don't cooperate. So we have these other instincts that we can harness that are really super important for helping us. And it turns out that those instincts are very closely related to cultivating mindfulness and cultivating compassion. One of them is, instead of orienting toward, what does this make me look like, what I'm doing, what will people think about me? What if we tried to do more activities simply as engagement? This is what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow experiences, where we're in it for the experience of it, not imagining some spectator watching us, not having an inner spectator watching us, but being in the moment in the way that mindfulness practices teach us to do. Well, that helps to get us out of this kind of self-preoccupation. And compassion practices are enormously useful because they help to connect us to others. When we're talking with a close friend, and we're being honest, and we're talking about stuff that we're ashamed of, and we're talking about our vulnerabilities, and we're talking about what it is to be a plain old human being going through the life cycle, and we connect, the whole thing's transformed. Because in a moment of connection like that, I'm not thinking, what does my friend think of me? In fact, I go from being a me to being a we. I feel part of this shared organism, which is us. And all of these kinds of concerns start to diminish. And if I'm super anxious about what other people think, how I'm doing, the connection really starts to let that go. And connection is such a powerful healer for depression, right? Because when we're depressed, we feel isolated. As soon as we start connecting, the whole thing shifts. So one of the principles that we can get from this and that we can really practice is to make a connection, not an impression. We spend so much of our lives trying to impress ourselves and impress others and trying to come out ahead and trying to look okay. And For some people, it's about achievement and money and glory. For other people, it's simply about, being popular, or being in the in group, or even just, I want to think of myself as being a good person. I desperately need to feel that I'm moral or whatever, and evaluating ourselves in those ways. If instead of being involved in all this self-evaluation, we were turning our attention to connection, well, the whole experience is transformed. And this becomes a really radical way to help with this fourth element. Taking this into the realm of spiritual practices, right? Whether in theistic traditions or non-theistic traditions, such as Buddhist traditions, it's really about letting go of this whole sense of separate self. It's about noticing that this organism that I call Ron is really part of the larger universe. And all of these attributes that I'm so preoccupied with, well, they came about by factors and forces, the accident of birth, the accident of particular genes, the accident of particular environmental conditions. All that I think of as what's good about me or bad about me, I didn't create any of this stuff. This is simply the manifestation of evolutionary history coming to this point in time, and all of the liking parts of ourselves, rejecting parts of ourselves, this all starts to fall away when we have a shift. And where we wind up is very ordinary. We wind up as very ordinary human beings. We're not so special, but that's really good news, because we get to be together with one another. And I think one more word about that, and I know we want to try a couple of exercises or an exercise, and do a little talk about a case law. I have a friend named Bob Waldinger, who is unusual in that he's a psychiatrist, he's a psychoanalyst, he's a Harvard Medical School professor, and he runs the Harvard Study on Adult Development, which is the longest running longitudinal study about human well-being. And he's a Zen priest, so he's got this spiritual perspective. Wonderful guy, and you can check out his TED Talk. It's very well known, Bob Waldinger. And so there's a study that he's been directing, which has been going on since the late 1930s, studying a bunch of Harvard undergraduates and comparing them to other kids from Boston, poor kids from Boston who didn't have the same level of privilege, and seeing, well, what are the factors that contribute to well-being? And he'll tell you the jury is in. We now know from studying in detail it was men, because Harvard was all male at the time, these men over these decades. And it's the quality of our relationships. And the guys who felt connected to other human beings didn't have to be harmonious. They could bicker, but they felt connected. They've thrived. And the ones who felt disconnected, not so much. So this getting out of ourselves and moving into connection becomes enormously important. And our capacity for compassion and self-compassion is integral to that. Because when we can be compassionate toward others and compassionate toward ourselves, that is when we connect, because we recognize that our suffering is like their suffering. We're all vulnerable human beings just trying to do the best we can, live this life, and it's challenging. And that tends to bring us together.
Thank you so much, and for reminding us of the results of the Grant study, and also in the words of Madam Gandhi in The Future is Female, I look forward to a future where we're linked and not ranked.
Yeah.
And
Did
as
you
I
say
like
that?
to say,
Really? I never heard that.
yes,
That's wonderful.
yes, and well, not Indira Gandhi. Madam Gandhi's a singer, but yes, but and then, as I like to say, it would be best if we seek not distinction so much, but connection, as you said. Yes, so maybe now we can turn to just go right into these actual practices. Perhaps you could lead us in a mindfulness and compassion practice that you would use with clients.
Okay. I'll just do this briefly, because we don't have a lot of time. This is best done over a longer period of time, but we'll just do it for a few minutes to give everybody a taste. So let's close our eyes. And let's just start by being present, noticing what we're experiencing in the body. Perhaps noticing the rhythm of the breath. Other sensations. And this is a practice I call stepping into fear. And it's actually designed to help us toward experiential approach rather than experiential avoidance, how to befriend our anxiety. And to do this, I'd like you to generate a little bit of anxiety. Not the scariest thing ever. No need to be overwhelmed, but just something that makes you a bit anxious. And just begin to feel the anxiety in the body. Notice however it manifests. Maybe your heart rate picking up a little bit, maybe breathing a little more quickly, maybe muscle tension somewhere in the body. Just begin to feel the sensations of anxiety. And all we're going to do is, instead of following our usual impulse, which is, how do I get rid of this? Let's make friends with it. Let's bring an attitude of mindful and loving compassion to the experience of anxiety. You might notice where exactly in the body you feel it most vividly, and put a hand over that part of the body, and maybe another hand over the first hand, so there's a little bit of gentle pressure. And just breathe with the feeling of anxiety, not to get rid of it, but to befriend it. This is my old friend, fear. It's been with me since birth. Helped me out a lot, got me out of the way of a lot of buses coming down the street. Helped me avoid accidents of all sorts. Maybe inform my judgment and help me make good choices sometimes. Super useful. All the other animals have it. Let me just breathe with and make friends with the sense of fear. Keep breathing. If it starts to fade a bit, ramp it up a little bit, just so you have some more time to practice. Again, don't think of something absolutely horribly frightening, but just something a little scary so you can still feel the fear, so that you can really make friends with this sensation of fear in the body. You may notice, as Schachter and Schachter did in their classic study back in the 1960s, that the physiological feeling of fear is very similar to excitement. Heart picking up, respiration picking up, a bit of muscle tension. Gosh, these are sensations of excitement also. And excitement's okay. So fear's okay. I can let myself be with it and feel it. What if I were no longer trying to run from this? What if, when fear arises in my life, I can just practice being with it exactly in this way? Just noticing the sensations, being loving, being friendly. Welcoming my old friend fear whenever it arises in consciousness. Knowing that, like all things, it's impermanent, it won't be here forever. And then you can allow your hands to go back down to someplace comfortable and just come back to the breath for a few moments. And allow the fear or the anxiety to reach its own level. If it wants to hang around, that's fine. It's welcome. If it wants to go somewhere else, that's fine too. We're just coming back into the body. And to bring this to a close, I'll ring a bell and let's just listen to the sound of the bell from the beginning until it trails off and can no longer be heard. Thank you for trying that experiment.
Yes, thank you so much. I certainly feel like that's one of those exercises one would have to lather, rinse, and repeat to keep generating that sense of being with the fear.
It kind of runs against our instinct, but we can
Right,
train ourselves
right.
to do this. Yeah.
Right, thank you. And so now, maybe to close out, if you have a case study that you might be willing to talk about to illustrate what we've been talking about.
Sure. Well, let me share briefly one that's more on the has to do with working with depression. And this is a fellow I've worked with for quite some time, who periodically would struggle with depression, and he would tend to get scared by medical models of depression, thinking, "Oh gosh, it runs in my family. I'm broken. There's something wrong with me." And as you alluded to a little bit earlier, Ravi, the idea of we might shift from the attitude of "What's wrong with me?" to "What happened to me?" And this is a case in which that's been much of our work. And our work has really been to help him. And he took up mindfulness practice. He did an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course so he could get some experience under his belt. And then starting to use the mindfulness practice to discover what are the emotions that are being inhibited by the depression. What's the depression actually made up of? And little by little, he would notice that when he would get into these depressive states, if he'd go inside and he'd start to check out, so what am I actually feeling? He noticed that he had an awful lot of longing for love. Sadly, he's been in a marriage which is really pretty dysfunctional for a very long time, in which he never gets or can give a hug. He never gets or can have the experience of really playing together. There's a lot of tension. It's a kind of marriage of obligation. And noticing that, oh gosh, underneath there's so much longing for love. And there's so much sadness about feeling really lonely. It's also one of these relationships where he's been rather cut off from friends because that's kind of part of the deal, you know, his wife's threatened by his having other friendships. And as he gets in touch with this loneliness and as he gets in touch with this longing for love, it's been very interesting. We've had many lather, rinse, and repeat, as you say, sessions with this. Each time, it's like the depression lifts for a little bit. He notices, he notices that he's sad, and he'll start to write about that or journal about that. And it's been a very slow process, but it's been a wonderful illustration of how when we can mindfully and compassionately connect with the feelings that are constellated in the depression shifts, and it shifts from something that is stuck and dead to something which is poignant and alive. Now, I won't say I've done miracles here, or because he still hasn't quite gotten himself into the kind of connected relationships in life that I think would address some of these longings for connection or love, but he's at least been able to identify it. And even to be able to identify it and to have that be understood has gone a long way toward loosening the solidity of the sense of depression.
Wow, yes, I can relate to many of my own experiences and many of my patients' experiences. This in terms of self-esteem, self-preoccupation, but also connection, as we've talked about, the need for love, which involves understanding, safety, nurturing, care, affection, all of those wonderful human qualities. So thank you for bringing us this full narrative arc from anxiety and depression, and helping our clients really understand and work towards those deeper journeys of belonging and love. So thank you for sharing this time with me, Dr. Siegel.
Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughtful questions. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your willingness to go along with these various ad hoc exercises along the way and report your experience. It's lovely to connect with you in this way.
Thank you so much. Happy to be a guinea pig anytime. All right. Thank you.